Hi, guys. Today we are talking about evolution and natural selection, which is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I hope that you are going to enjoy this experience. To start us off, this is just a little timeline of sort of the scientists that worked on evolution and the time periods where this discussion was really, really happening in the scientific community for the first time, with a lot of debate. And you probably know that evolution has remained for a long time a really, really hot topic, especially in regards to education and whether it should be taught in schools. If you're interested in law, um, specifically related to education, you should look up the Scopes trial, which is a really interesting case that happened to decide basically whether evolution should be taught in schools or not, because it went against the idea that God created the earth in 7 days. I'll talk more about the connection with evolution and religion in a minute, but it is an interesting thing to look up if you're interested in that sort of stuff. Anyways, so in the 1700s is the late 1700s is really when this conversation started about changes in species, and people started really noticing that the changes in species were happening, and also that organisms seemed really well fit to the environments that they lived in. The first scientist to ever publish a evolution hypothesis was named Lamarck. He published a hypothesis that basically said that organisms traits that they acquired throughout their lives were passed on to their offspring. He is the main thing that comes up with him is giraffes. So he had this hypothesis that if a giraffe stretched its neck super long to reach some leaves, then its offspring would have a longer neck. Of course, now we know that that is not the case, that acquired traits are not passed on, genetic traits are. So after that, Charles Darwin sort of came on the scene. There were a few other scientists who worked on this. Darwin gets almost all the credit for coming up with the evolution hypothesis. Um, but there were other scientists who were sort of in on this discussion as well. Eventually, in 1859, Darwin publishes his On the Origin of Species, which is the real evolution document that hypothesized that descent with modification was happening, which basically means that organisms pass on their traits to their offspring with modification coming from mutations and variation within the species. It was very, very debated when he published it. Definitely a lot of hot water, but now is the accepted sort of theory of evolution. All right. So now, before we go any further, did want to show you a few things about the Catholic Church and evolution. At this point, the Catholic Church and evolution are not at odds with one another. Um, so you are able to accept both without them being in conflict. Um, Basically, I kind of like to think of it as God is driving the evolutionary changes that are occurring. But you get to decide how you want to think about it and sort of what you want to believe, what you want to accept, and what you want to leave behind is up to you. I'm just here to teach you sort of the science behind what is out there. Okay, so now we can actually talk about natural selection. Natural selection, you also might know, is sometimes referred to as survival of the fittest. Um, Fittest being like the one that is most well suited to the environment that it lives in. Um, I'll talk about some examples of that in a moment. But Darwin referred to it as descent with modification, was his main thing. That was his proposal for how species change over time. You might know this about Darwin, but he did almost all of his research in the Galapagos Islands, which are tiny little islands off of South America. What's interesting about those islands is that each of the islands has a very different climates and sort of plant life. So what he noticed was that on the different islands, these birds called finches, which is what he studied mostly, and some tortoises, um, had specific beak shapes to eat the food that was on that island, which is really amazing if you think about it. Like, imagine you didn't know about evolution and you just showed up on these islands and you were like, wait, what? This is amazing. Like, why are there no birds with tiny beaks on this island and there's a million birds with tiny beaks on the one next door? And so that's kind of what Darwin was noticing and trying to figure out. Here's an example of some of the finches. You can see they're like cute little birds, but all of these finch species live in the Galapagos Islands, on different islands. You can see that they all have very different beak shapes, and that's because they're all eating different foods. And because for the one that eats cacti, there are no cacti on islands B and C. So if a bird ended up there, it wouldn't survive well because its beak isn't well suited to picking up insects or well suited to crunching seeds. So basically, that's how Darwin came up with his idea of natural selection, is that if a bird or any animal wasn't well suited to the environment, it wasn't able to get enough food to survive, and it didn't pass on its genes. So over time, what you have is you have organisms on these islands that are only well suited to the food source that's there because the other ones have all died off and their genes weren't passed on. That's how natural selection works. Just another thing about Darwin and some other scientists. So, at the same time that Darwin came up with his idea of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, who is a different scientist, had actually the exact same idea. Um, and he doesn't really get any credit for it. Like, nobody remembers him. But he also had the same idea of natural selection without like cheating off Darwin. He came up with it himself. And then the term natural selection didn't actually come up until one of Darwin's friends, Huxley, put that term on it. Darwin never actually used the term natural selection. But this guy, Huxley, was called Darwin's bulldog because he was like Team Darwin forever. And like I said before, Charles Darwin was under a lot of, I guess, conflict, or people didn't like him because he went against creationism and the concept of like God being the source of all life at the beginning of time. So, anyways, okay. So here's what Darwin noticed / figured out. So his observations are members of a population have variation in their traits. So even in the finches that live on the same island, they all have the same beak, they still do have variation. Like, not all of them are exactly the same. That's really important. He also noticed that traits are inherited from parents to offspring. So traits are being passed from the parents to the offspring. They're not acquired traits. They're traits that are genetic. At this time, Darwin, I don't think, was super aware of like what was going on in genetics, like with Mendel and all of that. But he was aware that these traits were being passed from the parent to the child. He also noticed that all species are capable of producing more offspring than their environment can support. So basically, what that means is that there is some sort of selective pressure. The selective pressure is lack of resources, but it also could be a predator. It could be something else. But in Darwin's case, what he observed was that it was a lack of resources, or in this case, food, that was causing a lot of offspring to not survive. So then, based off of his observation, he made these inferences that competition for survival led to some organisms surviving better than others. Some organisms are better competitors. When we talk about evolution, we talk about that as fitness. So I'll just make a note here that says fitness is how well suited an organism is for its environment. So, for example, if you had like some white rabbits that lived in an Arctic environment, you would say that they have high fitness. If you had some white rabbits and some brown rabbits, the white rabbits have high fitness, the brown rabbits have low fitness. And in that case, the like competition or the selective pressure would be the surrounding environment, like the color of the environment and the fact that there are predators trying to eat the rabbits. Okay, so similar to what I just said, individuals whose inherited traits, that's important that the traits are inherited, they're not acquired. So these are not things that the organisms have gained over time. For example, like you work out a bunch and you get super buff. Your children will not be born super buff because that's not a genetic trait. Only inherited traits will be acted on by evolution. Those individuals that have a higher fitness will most likely have more offspring, which we would call greater reproductive success. Organisms with lower fitness are going to have less offspring if they even make it to reproductive age. So this means that over time, favorable traits are going to start to build up in the population over many generations of time. Some really important things related to this are that one individual does not ever evolve. Populations evolve. One individual can adapt, but it will not evolve. Only a group of organisms evolves. Traits influenced by natural selection have to be heritable. That means they have to be genetic. Heritable and genetic are the same. Environments are always changing. So what this means is that what is high fitness can shift in an instant. Example, the rabbits in the Arctic. In the winter, the white rabbits have higher fitness. In the summer, the snow melts, the brown rabbits have higher fitness. So all the time, things are shifting and changing. And it's not like you have higher fitness, you have higher fitness forever. If you go somewhere else, you don't have higher fitness anymore. Also, chance and random events also influence evolution. Random events are things like a volcano erupting or an earthquake, things that just sort of knock out a bunch of stuff without selective pressure. It just happens. And that's chance too. Like sometimes it doesn't matter if you had higher fitness or not, you got buried in lava. So you didn't get to pass on your gene. As a summary, there are 4 things that have to be true for natural selection to happen in a population. And I'm going to write them right here. So I'm going to say for natural selection. Oops. You must have variation among the individuals. If you don't have variation, nothing has higher fitness because everything's the same. So you have to have some sort of differences going on within the population. You have to have a selective pressure. So you have to have some source for competition. If the organisms live in an environment where there's just endless food, then food is not a selective pressure. One trait is no better than the other. The third thing that has to be true is you have to have inheritance. You have to have heritable traits. Acquired traits are not acted on in natural selection. Finally, the last thing that you have to have is you have to have generations of time, a really long time for evolution. Now, for some things like bacteria, generations of time doesn't take that long. But for mammals, it takes a really, really long time for a population to evolve because it takes many generations for these changes to actually become visible. Yeah. Okay, so that's natural selection. Now, let's talk more about evolution of populations. Like I said before, this is all really fueled at its root by variation. Variation results in changes in phenotypes. A phenotype, don't forget, is physical appearance. So if a trait does not affect a physical appearance, if it only affects like a non-coding region or some part of the DNA that doesn't change the phenotype, then that gene or that mutation will not be acted on by evolution. It has to affect the phenotype. Now, remember that phenotype could be like external physical appearance, but it also could be like your ability to digest a certain protein or whatever. That's part of your phenotype too. All right, so variation in individuals can be quantified using a measure called heterozygosity. Average heterozygosity means the percent of genes for which an individual is heterozygous. The higher percentage that is, the more variation is present. And for some populations, you can directly compare individual karyotypes or gene sequences in each population. Sometimes the difference is really, really dramatic when you look at like the variation within species, and sometimes it's more gradual. If it's more gradual, we call that a cline. So it's like a slow change. A lot of times the heterozygosity and the differences that exist because of geographic isolation, which basically means like you have two groups of or squirrels, let's say, that live in different areas of a forest or something like that. You're going to have more variation between those two groups because they're less likely to influence one another. At the end of the day, genetic variation occurs for two main reasons. The first one is sexual reproduction. Variation occurs from sexual reproduction because, like we talked about in meiosis, we have random assortment, which means that chromosomes always move randomly. So, like, you might get two of moms on this side, two of dads on this side, or you might get one of moms, one of dads. It's random every time. Also, random fertilization. Which means that you have no way of predicting which sperm or which egg is going to come together. You have only half of mom's genes and half of dad's genes in every given sperm or egg, depending on if you're male or female. And there's no way of controlling like which ones of moms you get and which ones of dads you get. The other one that's really big here is crossing over, which we talked about in meiosis when you have the chromosomes and they switch ends. So you're getting not even an entire dad's chromosome, you're getting some of dad's chromosome with a little bit of mom's. You have an entirely new chromosome that never even existed before. And then mutation is the biggest source of genetic variation because it can happen in every single organism. Sexual reproduction, of course, is only going to happen in organisms that reproduce sexually. So for things like bacteria and unicellular organisms, mutation is the main source of new genetic variation for them. Really important that mutations are random. Here, mutations are random. So there is not a way to control when they show up, how they show up, whether they're good, bad, or neither. They're random events. So every once in a while, what you end up getting is a random mutation that happened to be adaptive, that gave the rabbit white fur. It was albino, and that happened to be great because it lived in the snow. And then that one was able to pass on its traits more often than the brown ones because the brown ones were getting eaten and dying. So it's entirely a random event. It's not controlled in any way in natural selection. In artificial selection, we can sort of drive that. But for natural selection, mutation is the number one source of variation, and it's also a random source of variation. Okay, so let's talk about some times when you can see natural selection at work. Again, this is related to phenotype, so you're able to really see what's happening. The first example is peppered moths. Peppered moths are moths. Typically, they're like whitish gray, and they have like black speckles on them. So in England, the peppered moths were like living their life, doing their thing. They blended into birch trees, which are really common in England. They're the trees that have kind of like peely bark that you can like peel off. But the peppered moths look pretty much exactly like that. So they were pretty well adapted to their environment. Then Industrial Revolution struck. All these factories opened, soot blowing into the air all the time. There was so much soot that the bark on the birch trees actually started to turn black, which is crazy, but it happened. So then the moths that were white with the black spots were suddenly low fitness because they didn't blend in anymore. A random mutation happened, or had already happened, that caused some of the moths to be solid black. And those moths now, because the trees were covered in soot, could blend in to the birch trees. And so they were less likely to get eaten by the birds. So what happened is during the Industrial Revolution, there was actually a shift in the peppered moths' coloration to where they became mostly black moths, which is wild. And that's natural selection at work because the birds started to eat the peppered ones, and the black ones were able to pass on their traits more often. Another example that's really fascinating is sickle cell anemia. So we've talked about sickle cell a little bit when we did Punnett squares, but I'm going to talk about it now. So if you have two recessive alleles, you have sickle cell anemia. You also have resistance to malaria. Resistance. So people who have sickle cell anemia cannot get malaria. Okay. People who have two dominant alleles, two big H's, are normal in terms of their blood. They have normal shaped blood cells, normal hemoglobin. These people can get malaria. Which, if you don't know about malaria, it's a blood parasite that infects red blood cells and is carried by mosquitoes. Now, here's where it gets kind of crazy is that people who are heterozygous, they have normal blood, but they also have malaria resistance. So what happens is that these people who are heterozygous, they actually have an advantage because they don't have sickle cell anemia. So they're not likely to, sickle cell anemia greatly reduces life expectancy. And people who have it have these really painful crises that it's actually like a very painful disease. But people who have sickle cell, their life expectancy is like mid 40s. So they really don't live very long. Malaria is also deadly for some people. So the people who are heterozygous really are living the best case scenario, which means that they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to pass on their genes. This is why we still see people who have sickle cell anemia being born, because when two people who are heterozygous have a child, there's a 25% chance that their child will have sickle cell. Also, another interesting thing about this is that this is only the case where this is an advantage. I'm going to label that this is called heterozygote advantage. It's a G. But heterozygote advantage only is true for sickle cell in tropical regions, because in regions where there are not really mosquitoes and malaria is not common, there's no advantage to being heterozygous over being dominant. So this heterozygote advantage only exists in some regions, which are, you know, the tropical regions of Africa, South and Central America, and some parts of Asia. But it's a super fascinating story that is related to evolution, and that's why sickle cell still exists today. Okay, a couple other examples. One of them is DDT resistance in insects. DDT is a pesticide that for a long time farmers were just like spraying in huge amounts all over their fields. Some insects, by random chance, had a mutation against DDT, which allowed them to survive the pesticide. So then what happens is those will be the only insects that are able to reproduce then, which means that basically the farmer has accelerated natural selection way, 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 way faster than it ever should have been. Um, and so the next time there would need to be a stronger pesticide in order to kill off those insects that were resistant. Um, some other human impacts, artificial selection is a way to basically choose the traits that you want. That's how domestic dogs started to happen. Basically, some wolves were really friendly, and humans like only mated those ones over and over again to produce a dog. And then the overuse of antibiotics is also a big issue. So when you take an antibiotic, let's say you have strep throat, you take an antibiotic, you probably are taking a pretty mild antibiotic at that point, because strep is, my mom, who's a doctor, refers to it as dumb, which means it usually is easy to kill with an antibiotic. Um, so let's say you take your antibiotic for a couple days. You're like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. I'm going to stop taking my antibiotic now because I feel good. Probably at that point, you haven't killed off all the strep. You've killed off enough strep to help you feel better, but you haven't killed off all of it. So then what actually can happen and does happen is some bacteria in your body that are resistant to the antibiotic, because probably you've taken it before, and probably the bacteria that live in your gut, and some bacteria that live in your throat and your mouth are resistant to whatever that antibiotic is. So bacteria can actually pass plasmids, circles of DNA, to one another. And one of those plasmids that they can pass is resistance. So what can happen then is the good bacteria that are in your body helping you digest your food and live your life can pass a resistance plasmid to the strep bacteria. Then the strep bacteria can divide. In a couple days, you're sick again. You have strep. And when you get your antibiotic, it's not going to work now. You're going to need a stronger one. And this is actually a really big concern on a larger scale, because this has happened with a lot of bacteria a lot of times, to the point where we're looking at some like super bugs like MRSA, which is resistant to several antibiotics. And we're running out of antibiotics, straight up. Development for them is not fast enough to keep up with the mutation rate in bacteria. So the moral of that story is don't take an antibiotic unless you actually really need it. And take the whole thing so that you kill off all the bad bacteria before you stop. Okay, here's an example of artificial selection. This was on your GMOs document, but these are all plants that have been domesticated into their specific versions from this original wild mustard plant, which is really crazy. Basically, what happens is farmers just take plants that have the trait that they want. They only mate those plants until they have basically like enlarged that aspect of the plant. So, for example, in broccoli, they're selecting for the flowers. So they're taking like wild mustard plants that have large flowers, mating those, mating them again. Like now they're picking the ones with the biggest flowers, mating them. Now they're picking the ones with the biggest flowers, mating them. Eventually, you have like a broccoli sort of deal. Kale selecting for the leaves. So you're looking for like the plants with the largest leaves, mating them. Plants with the largest leaves, mating them over and over again until you have kale. So there you go. Pretty cool. Okay, we're almost done. What I said before, fitness is relative. The environment's always changing, so things are always shifting around. Depending on which traits are being favored, there are three possible options for natural selection, like influencing populations, and we call them directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. In directional selection, one extreme is favored over the other traits. In disruptive, both extremes are favored, and in stabilizing, the average is favored. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that right now. Alrighty, so here's some mice. We have the original population up at the top. On the left, you have really, really light colored white mice. And on the right, you have dark colored mice. So now let's look at A. Let's say that we have mice that live in a forest and the forest floor is pretty dark brown. So that means what's going to happen is when birds swoop down to eat mice, they're going to probably see and eat the light colored mice first. That means the light colored mice aren't going to get to reproduce. They aren't going to pass on their genes very often. And on the contrary, the dark colored mice that were able to camouflage are going to be able to mate more often. They're going to have more offspring, and so on and so forth. So, what we're going to see over many generations, which is the dotted line, is a shift in the average of color towards darker. That's directional selection. I'm going to make a note here. This is darker has highest fitness, because environment is dark. Okay, now let's look at B. So B is disruptive selection. Originally, we have most of our mice that are average color. They're like tan. Now, let's say that these mice live in a desert and the sand is really, really, really light and there's some rocks that are really dark. So what that means is that some mice are going to be able to hide in the sand, the light colored ones. The dark colored ones are going to be able to hide in the rocks. The tan ones that are in the middle, they're not going to be able to hide anywhere because they don't blend into anything. So again, when the hawk swoops down, it's going to see those light brown tan mice first, going to eat them. They're going to reproduce less often. That's disruptive selection. So you start to see two peaks in the graph with a dip in the middle. Just say this is light and dark have higher fitness over the tan mice. This one can eventually lead to having two different species of mice if you have a situation where the mice are isolated from one another. So you have maybe the brown ones like never leaving the rocks and the light ones like never going to the rocks because they'll stand out. They're not smart enough to know that, but you could have that sort of situation eventually happening where they change so much that they can no longer mate and then they would be a new species. All right, and then the last option is stabilizing selection, where the average is favored over the others. So now let's say the mice live in a wheat field and they're all wheat colored, these ones, the average, the tan ones. So over time, the ones that are really light, they're going to get picked off. The ones that are really dark, they're going to get picked off. The wheat colored ones, they're going to survive the most and produce the most offspring. And so you're going to see the graph getting narrower and narrower with a higher and higher peak because you have more and more that are that color in this case. So you're seeing less variation. The variation is shrinking with this version. Okay, so this would be tan mice survive better than either light or dark mice. And that is directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. Okay, last thing I'll say today is just there are two types of evolution. They're microevolution, which means you're looking at evolution of allele frequencies within just one population. So this would be like small scale changes in one population. Like the mice that we were just looking at, that would be micro. Macroevolution is looking at evolution over really long time spans, like a new species evolving. So like the geologic time scale and thinking about that and the species that are showing up and that sort of stuff, that would be macroevolution. Much longer time, much bigger scale. Okay, that's it for today. Oh wait, no, it's not. Sorry. It's not. One more thing. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is just evidence for evolution and how we know that it's real at this point. So, like current things we can really look at. One of them is, like I was saying before, superbugs. So we have created these superbugs using like the overuse of medication, basically. So that's one example. We also have the fossil record we can look at. The fossil record is number one, incomplete, which means not everything is fossilized and also not every fossil has been found. But what has been found helps us because it gives us ways to fill in the gaps, like intermediate species that we didn't know about before. For example, there's one, it's called like Archaeopteryx, that is the link between lizards and birds. So it helped scientists to say, okay, lizards and birds are like very closely related, and this organism is an example of an organism that was between them, that had characteristics of both. The same is also true about whales and hippos. There's like fossils that link the two like very closely together, which is really interesting. It tells us that whales actually came from or like evolved from a terrestrial mammal, not an aquatic one, which is cool. That's the fossil record. Anatomical features. So we can look at embryology, which is patterns of fetal development. I'm going to put that here. Embryology. I think that looks right. Homology, which is this picture of these arm bones here. So you can see that the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat all have the same bones in their arms. They're color coded. They're just different sizes, which is really fascinating and supports evolution because if you were going to design a whale's flipper, you wouldn't put all those weird bones in there. They're just there because they're left over from a common ancestor, a terrestrial ancestor. So that's homologous structures, and that is its support of evolution. And then also vestigial structures, which means structures that used to be useful and now they're not anymore, but we still have them, and other animals do too. For us, some examples are our appendix, our wisdom teeth, and our tailbone, which obviously, like the purpose of a tailbone is to connect to a tail. You don't have a tail, so you don't need a tailbone. Also in whales, they have pelvic bones, which again is another support that whales are evolved from a terrestrial ancestor, which is crazy. It blows my mind. You can look it up, but they're just like tiny little pelvic bones like floating in the middle of their body. Also, biochemical evidence or molecular similarities have really, really supported evolution in recent history. Basically, the ability to sequence DNA and compare it to other organisms has allowed us to really confirm that evolution is definitely a real deal. For example, humans and cats share 90% of the same genetic code. Only 10% is the differences between you and a cat. Humans and bananas share 50% of the same DNA. And then all humans share 99.9% of the same DNA, which is crazy. So all the differences that make you who you are is only 0.1% of your DNA, which is another argument that racism is the worst and doesn't make sense. Side note. Finally, there are mathematical models and simulations that can help us to support evolution. We're going to do one of those mathematical models next week called Hardy-Weinberg that basically allows you to predict different allele frequencies in populations. And then also phylogenetic trees, which are the charts that show relatedness between organisms, are another example of that. Just want to show you one more picture. Here is a example of embryology. So you have here a chick embryo and a human embryo, and this one is also really interesting to look at too. But you can see that you had a tail early in your development. You also had pharyngeal pouches, which act like gills when you're inside your mom. I mean, think about that. That's a watery environment, so you need to be able to breathe. Your tail undergoes apoptosis and goes away. And then your gills eventually like also leave. But you can see the similarities in the chick embryo and the human embryo are very obvious and very interesting. That supports the concept that we all came from a similar ancestor. Here's another image of that. So this shows like first, second, third trimester development of 8 different animals. Going from left to right, you have a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and then a human. So you can see that all of the first stage of development in all of those different animals is really almost identical, which is amazing and really cool and supports evolution as a concept. So there you go. Alrighty, now I am truly done. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon. Let me know if you have questions.